This is being recorded around about lunchtime on Sunday. I've just finished watching last night's boxing action in the US, and I'm gonna sit down and hopefully make two videos back to back. We're gonna start with the heavyweights. We're gonna start by talking Jarrell Miller versus Gerald Washington. Jarrell Miller wins the fight. Washington stopped in his corner by the referee after 8 rounds of action. Realistically, if you haven't seen the fight, I would say it is a classic case of cat and mouse. It's a classic case of pressure fighter versus long range boxer. In the first round, when both guys were completely fresh, I would say Gerald Washington actually won the round. He was able to dance around the outskirts of the ring. He was able to get some decent long range work off, and he was actually connecting with Jarrell Miller a little bit. You know, he was throwing a right hook that kind of, Jarrell Miller had this very sort of high guard as he came forward, and Washington was kind of throwing this hook that almost came round like the side of the guard and was landing on Jarrell Miller. Washington landed to the body once or twice with hooks that were quite nice. He was trying to get his jab going, he was moving, and yeah, the first round I gave to Gerald Washington. But right from that first round, I think the writing was kind of on the wall. Washington was having to do a huge amount of movement, circling the ring continuously and swiftly, whilst Jarrell Miller had his hands up and he was just taking the short route. He was just coming forward, taking punches on the gloves, and even though Jarrell Miller didn't really have the activity in that first round to win that round, you kind of got the impression that he was the comfortable guy in there, and you kind of got the impression that he was the guy fighting at the pace and distance that he wanted to. In round 2, Jarrell Miller started to come onto Gerald Washington's chest a bit more regularly, and regularly in the second round, you're seeing Gerald Washington actually being cornered. You know, Miller's been able to work him so his back's back to the ropes. Maybe he's stuck in one of the corners, and you see Miller starting to put punches together. Miller's work rate in the early rounds was actually decent. It was a slow start round 1, but rounds 2, 3, 4, he kept trudging forward. He kept finding Washington. He kept cornering Washington, and he kept putting punches together, punches in bunches, heavy punches, and Washington just didn't look completely comfortable in there. It was a kind of a fight where when Washington was able to fight at range, maybe he was the better guy in there. When Miller was able to close down the distance, he was definitely the better guy in there. And unfortunately for Washington, Miller was able to close him down with increasing regularity, and that really was the pattern of the fight for the next couple of rounds. Miller was winning. I think he probably won everything from round 2 through to round 8. He kept coming forward, and Washington didn't really have any answers, and the fight started to become increasingly one-sided. From Washington's perspective, I would have liked to have seen him try to employ a bit more of a jab. He almost had like a David Price style pouring jab, where he was just kind of like tapping it out. You know, when you're in a fight where you've got a shorter guy who's going to continuously try and close the range, try and get on your chest, a sort of ramrod jab that's going to help keep him at distance is going to be absolutely key in terms of being able to dictate the range and being able to dictate the pace. But Washington didn't really have it, and Miller was just able to walk through his jab, and realistically Washington's lack of power meant that Miller was able to walk through the majority of what he threw without too much fuss. As for Jarrell Miller, interesting actually. He's taken this step up in class. He's been inactive for about a year, and he's gone and he's stopped a guy like Gerald Washington, who's coming off a world title fight. So credit goes to him for that. I must admit, I am possibly less convinced by Jarrell Miller now as I was at the start of the fight. I thought that his punches notably started to decrease in terms of snap and speed after the first 4 rounds, which is perhaps not a surprise, seeing as he weighed in at about 21.5 stone for this fight, 298 pounds I believe, so it's no surprise. He kept his work rate up, he kept throwing punches, he kept coming forward, he stayed active, don't get me wrong. It just seemed that he was pushing his punches out a bit more to me. They weren't like hard, snappy punches, and it may be that if he's able to come in 15, 20 pounds lighter, there's a bit more snap and a bit more weight and speed behind those punches in the middle to late rounds of a fight. And I thought that was relatively telling. I expected Jarrell Miller perhaps to get Gerald Washington out of there earlier on in the fight. We saw how Gerald Washington folded against Deontay Wilder, and I thought Jarrell Miller may be able to get him out of there as quick as Deontay, if not quicker, because whilst Deontay is a massive puncher, he really stood off Gerald Washington in their fight and allowed Washington to box from range, whereas Jarrell Miller was putting it on Gerald Washington from much earlier on in the fight, and he was landing, you know, and his punches. Jarrell Miller is obviously a puncher with decent power. He's got a high knockout ratio. I don't believe, having watched this fight, he's got the punching power of a Deontay Wilder or the punching power of an Anthony Joshua. I don't think he's got that kind of one-punch knockout, put you to sleep, you know, style power. I don't think he's that kind of guy. I think he's more a sort of very aggressive presser fighter who's going to sit on your chest, grind you down, wear you out, and bring a high work rate. But I do think Miller would potentially be vulnerable at this stage of his career, especially if his power does start to decrease, which was what my eyes were telling me after a couple of rounds. Because I do think he's going to be very vulnerable to a moving boxer. You look at the success that Gerald Washington had in that first round. Now, if he was fighting against a fighter who had the ability to move for 12 rounds and also had perfected a jab, you know, a double jab, a jab that goes high, goes low, a jab that, you know, catches you and kind of sticks you, you know, keeps you in your tracks. If Jarrell Miller was fighting against a guy like that, I think he could potentially be in trouble, especially a guy who's a lot harder to find than Gerald Washington. Because even in the last 30 seconds before Gerald Washington gets stopped, even when the fight is nearing its conclusion, yeah, if you re-watch those last 30 seconds, you'll notice Jarrell Miller's actually eating quite a lot of punches. Gerald Washington is landing on him with a level of regularity, and he's catching him, you know, over and over again. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe that Gerald Washington kind of realised that there was nothing to worry about from Jarrell Miller in the form of power, I guess you could say. But I think that high guard that he's employing, you know, he kind of keeps his hands high and just trudges forward, means that he's potentially very vulnerable to, you know, hooks and punches that come around the guard, maybe an uppercut that comes from underneath the guard. Certainly work to the body, especially coming in as heavy as he does. I think that with that high guard, he perhaps leaves some room to bank punches to the body early on in fights as well. So I wonder about Jarrell Miller. I wonder, you know, if you were to look at a style of guy who you'd pick to beat him, I think a guy like Hughie Fury would potentially give him all he could handle. You know, someone who's very elusive, hard to find, keeps range very effectively, has really perfected and commits to his jab, you know, has that body punching element to his game. I think that would be a very hard fight for Jarrell Miller. And I also think if Jarrell Miller was to get one of these world title fights, the likes of Deontay Wilder, who I know he's been calling out, I think Jarrell Miller would have to be very careful defensively, because whilst he hasn't given us any causes for concerns about his durability in fights in his career to date, you've got to remember that the guys he's been in with, the likes of Fred Cassie, the likes of Gerald Washington, these are notably non-punchers. These are guys who don't really carry a lot of power. And the way he's defensively open and the way he doesn't really, he's not too defensively minded, you know, you just wonder if a guy like a Deontay Wilder could catch him and could clip him. You know, I think that's really relevant, especially in the later parts of the fight, because, you know, even though I've said in this fight, perhaps Jarrell Miller's punching power had started to dip a little bit after 6 or 7 rounds, he still kind of had the fight all his own way, really. Gerald Washington wasn't putting up that much resistance, but you wonder, in an even fight, if he started to tire, and if he was defensively open, would power punches from the likes of a Wilder or a Joshua, could they really affect him? So all in all, I think Jarrell Miller is an interesting fighter. Stylistically, he's very interesting. You know, the way he applies pressure, the size, the way he throws punches in bunches on the inside and those uppercuts, I think there's a lot to like about him. Stamina over 12 rounds against a live opponent who, you know, will be key. Whether he can close down the range that effectively against a guy with a you know, a perfected jab will be absolutely key. And how good is his chin, because with those defensive frailties is going to need to be good if he's calling out the likes of a Deontay Wilder. Needless to say, he's going to be in entertaining fights inside the ring. He's certainly going to be in entertaining fights outside the ring because of his mouth. And I think stylistically, he does create some challenges. I don't think guys like Joshua and Wilder would be comfortable with a guy like Jarrell Miller if he was able to get onto their chests and apply the level of pressure he applied to Gerald Washington last night. I think they'd struggle with that. The question is, will he be able to implement those style against those kind of heavyweights who carry their own power and carry jabs and that sort of thing. Let me know your thoughts on this fight, people. I like Jarrell Miller. I do question whether his knockout ratio is truly reflective of his power, especially having seen the fight last night. I have the first inclinations now that his power isn't quite as big as I maybe thought it was going into the fight. But let me know your thoughts. I'm rambling now. Leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed this video, do take the time to hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I'm going to try and drop a Broner Garcia video imminently, so hit subscribe so you can check that out as well when it comes up. Thanks for watching, guys.